For 13 years, a U.S. Army sergeant sold NATO's most secret war plans to the Soviet bloc. Every defensive position, every nuclear storage site, every move we would make if the Russians invaded. Master Sergeant Clyde Lee Conrad held the keys to NATO's vault in West Germany. The Pentagon trusted him with documents so classified that even mentioning their names required special clearance. Battle plans worth more than nuclear weapons. Intelligence that would have cost tens of thousands of American lives in the first 48 hours of World War III. But Conrad wasn't just selling paper. He built an entire spy ring inside the U.S. Army. Fellow soldiers who thought they were his friends became his assets. And for over a decade, while American troops trained with compromised plans, while NATO generals studied strategies the Soviets already knew, Conrad deposited millions of Deutsche Marks into Swiss accounts. The most chilling part wasn't the money or even the betrayal. It was what a Soviet defector revealed in 1987, a single sentence that changed everything the CIA thought they knew about the Cold War's darkest secret. Your sergeant wasn't working alone. He was just the one we caught. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm curious how far these hidden Cold War stories travel. And if you want more untold histories that your textbooks never mentioned, subscribe now, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the Cold War forever. The 8th Infantry Division headquarters in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany, stood like a fortress against the Soviet threat. Just 200 miles from the Iron Curtain, this base represented NATO's front line of defense. And deep within its most secure building, behind steel doors and cipher locks, lay the vault that contained the Alliance's most precious secrets. In 1974, Master Sergeant Clyde Lee Conrad became the guardian of that vault. At 37 years old, Conrad had already spent half his life in uniform. Born in Ohio in 1937, he joined the Army at 19. Searching for purpose and stability his small-town life couldn't provide. By the time he reached Bad Kreuznach, he'd earned a reputation as the consummate professional. Meticulous, disciplined, the kind of non-commissioned officer who made the military machine function. His new assignment carried enormous responsibility. As chief custodian of classified documents for the 8th Infantry Division, Conrad controlled access to NATO's General Defense Plan, the master blueprint for defending Western Europe against Soviet invasion. These documents detailed everything: which bridges would be destroyed to slow enemy advances, where nuclear weapons were stored, how reinforcements would deploy, which cities would be defended, and which would be sacrificed. Every morning, Conrad would arrive before dawn, unlock the vault, and prepare classified materials for the day's briefings. Officers would request specific documents, and Conrad would retrieve them, log them out, ensure their return. He memorized every file location, every security protocol. The vault became his domain, and he ruled it with quiet efficiency. His fellow soldiers respected him. In the hierarchical world of the military, Conrad occupied that crucial middle ground, senior enough to command authority, still close enough to enlisted men to understand their frustrations. He drank beer with them in German taverns, listened to their complaints about officers and promotions, shared their resentment at being stationed far from home while diplomats and generals made decisions that affected their lives. But Conrad carried his own resentments, carefully hidden beneath his professional exterior. Despite his competence, promotions came slowly. Younger men with college degrees advanced past him. Officers treated him as a glorified filing clerk, essential but unremarkable. He watched them drive better cars, live in better quarters, return to better opportunities in civilian life. Meanwhile, Conrad handled documents that could determine the fate of nations, yet earned less than a factory worker back home. The approach came in 1975, so subtle Conrad might have missed it if he hadn't been unconsciously waiting for it. Zoltán Szabó didn't look like a spy. The Hungarian intelligence officer posed as a legitimate businessman, one of many Europeans who frequented the bars and restaurants near American bases. He spoke excellent English with just enough accent to seem authentic. He dressed well, but not too well. He had a warm laugh and bought rounds of drinks without seeming desperate for friendship. Their first conversations were innocent. Szabo showed interest in American culture, asked about life in the military, sympathized with the challenges of being stationed overseas. He never pushed, never probed too directly. Instead, he let Conrad talk, and Conrad found himself opening up to this understanding stranger who seemed to grasp the fundamental unfairness of his situation. In the business world, Szabo mentioned one evening, information is everything. A man who knows things others don't, that man has real value. Conrad understood the implication immediately, yet he didn't walk away. Something in him had been waiting for this moment, this recognition that what he controlled had worth beyond the military's rigid pay scales. The first exchange happened almost accidentally. Conrad had been complaining about money troubles. His car needed repairs. His wife wanted to visit family in America. Szabo offered to help, businessman to friend. All Conrad had to do was share some general information. Nothing sensitive, just broad insights about military procedures that any observant person might notice. Conrad photographed a single document. Nothing critical, he told himself. A routine administrative memo about training schedules. Szabo passed him an envelope containing 5,000 Deutsche Marks. More than 2 months of Conrad's salary for 5 minutes of work. The ethical line, once crossed, disappeared entirely. Conrad began studying the documents in his vault with new eyes, evaluating their intelligence value. He acquired a better camera, learned to photograph quickly and clearly. He memorized which materials his handlers valued most, not just battle plans, but the technical appendices, the logistics tables, the mundane details that revealed NATO's true capabilities and limitations. By early 1976, Conrad had established a routine. He would arrive at the vault early, before anyone else. While supposedly preparing for the day's work, he would photograph documents, sometimes entire manuals. The small camera fit easily in his palm. The soft click of its shutter became as familiar as his own heartbeat. The money arrived regularly, in amounts that staggered him. 10,000 marks. 20,000. Payments that dwarfed his annual military salary. Conrad opened bank accounts across Germany, later in Switzerland. He bought a house off the military base, explaining it as a smart investment. He purchased a Mercedes, telling colleagues he'd gotten a deal from a German friend. His wife Anya enjoyed their new prosperity without questioning its source too deeply. But Conrad's greatest innovation wasn't his photography technique or his money laundering. It was recognizing that one man, however well placed, could only steal so much. By 1978, Clyde Conrad had become something more dangerous than a spy. He had become a spy master. The transformation began with a simple observation. During his daily work in the vault, Conrad noticed how many other soldiers had access to classified materials. Document clerks, communication specialists, logistics coordinators, each held pieces of NATO's puzzle. Alone, their knowledge seemed limited. Together, they could provide a complete picture of the alliance's defenses. Conrad's first recruit was Roderick Ramsey, a document custodian drowning in debt from a messy divorce. Conrad had watched Ramsey's decline for months, the calls from creditors, the second job that barely covered child support, the bitterness that crept into every conversation. One evening, after several beers, Conrad made his approach. "What if I told you there was a way to solve your money problems?" Conrad said quietly. "Nothing illegal. Just sharing information with some European businessmen who pay well for consulting." Ramsey's resistance crumbled within minutes. Conrad didn't mention Hungary or the Soviet Union. He painted it as harmless industrial espionage, corporations wanting insight into military procedures. The first payment, 3,000 marks for photographing supply schedules, erased any remaining doubts. Geoffrey Rondeau came next, an ambitious sergeant frustrated by passed-over promotions. Then Thomas Lipka, who handled communication protocols. Each recruitment followed Conrad's careful script. Never mention communism, never reveal the true buyers, frame it as consultancy, business intelligence, victimless profit. Conrad compartmentalized everything. His recruits didn't know about each other. They believed they worked for anonymous European clients interested in military logistics. Only Conrad knew the intelligence flowed to Budapest, then to Moscow. He became the hub of a wheel whose spokes reached into every corner of NATO's defensive planning. The network's productivity astonished even Conrad's handlers. Where once he could photograph perhaps 50 pages a week, his network now produced hundreds. Complete war plans, nuclear deployment schedules, communication frequencies, reinforcement timetables, the locations of command bunkers that would coordinate NATO's response to invasion. In 1980, Conrad achieved his greatest intelligence coup. NATO had just completed a massive revision of its general defense plan, incorporating lessons from new Soviet capabilities. The document ran thousands of pages, detailing exactly how NATO would respond to various invasion scenarios. It revealed which units would move, where, when nuclear weapons would be authorized, how long each defensive line was expected to hold. Conrad didn't just photograph sections, he stole the entire plan. The operation took weeks. Each night, Conrad would smuggle out different portions, photograph them in his home, then return them before morning. His handlers could barely believe the windfall. Soviet military planners in Moscow studied every page, adjusting their own strategies accordingly. They knew NATO's weaknesses better than many NATO commanders. The money became almost absurd. Conrad received 50,000 marks for the general defense plan alone. His handlers provided him with Swiss bank account numbers, Austrian financial contacts, a web of monetary channels that cleaned the blood from his payments. He bought his mother a house in Ohio, telling her it came from successful investments. He paid cash for everything, lived well but not ostentatiously, maintained the facade of a successful retired sergeant who'd made smart financial choices. But success brought paranoia. Conrad began noticing things: a car parked too long near his house, a stranger who seemed too interested in conversation, phone calls with suspicious clicks. He varied his routes, checked for surveillance, developed the habits of a hunted man, even when no one was hunting him yet. His relationship with his handlers evolved. The jovial Sabo was replaced by a colder operative known only as Alex, who pressed for specific intelligence about new American technologies, the Strategic Defense Initiative, stealth aircraft capabilities, satellite reconnaissance systems. Conrad promised what he could deliver and worried about what he couldn't. In 1983, his paranoia proved justified, though he didn't know it. NATO conducted Able Archer, a command exercise so realistic that Soviet leadership briefly believed it might be cover for an actual first strike. The world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since Cuba. Conrad's intelligence helped convince Moscow that the exercise was just that, an exercise. He had, in his own twisted way, helped prevent World War III. But the human cost accumulated. Conrad watched young American soldiers training with tactics the Soviets had already countered. He saw officers studying defensive positions that had been compromised years ago. During a briefing about casualty estimates in case of Soviet invasion, Conrad sat silent, knowing the real numbers would be far worse because of what he'd sold. His marriage crumbled. Anya sensed the weight he carried, the secrets that poisoned every conversation. Conrad drank heavily, seeking oblivion in German beer and American whiskey. He would walk for hours through the countryside around Bad Kreuznach, perhaps wondering if he was being followed, perhaps hoping his handlers would simply disappear and let him forget what he'd become. By 1985, Conrad had created something that transcended him, a machine that gathered NATO's secrets with mechanical efficiency. Even as he approached retirement, his network continued producing. He had built his own intelligence service within the U.S. Army, and it had made him wealthy beyond imagination. It had also made him the most damaging spy in NATO's history. Clyde Conrad retired from the U.S. Army in September 1985, but freedom proved to be another form of prison. He couldn't leave Germany. His handlers made that clear during a tense meeting in a Frankfurt hotel room. Conrad had served his purpose too well. He knew too much, controlled too valuable a network. The KGB, through their Hungarian intermediaries, considered him an asset that required careful management. Leaving Europe would raise questions. Staying kept him accessible, useful, and under control. So Conrad remained in Bad Kreuznach, establishing a computer consulting business as cover for his continued existence. To his neighbors, he was the successful American expatriate who'd fallen in love with Germany. He spoke decent German now, understood the culture, had built a comfortable life. His house was modest but well-appointed. His Mercedes was 3 years old, expensive enough to show success, not so flashy as to attract attention. But the network he'd built continued functioning without him. His recruits, still active in the military, fed intelligence through the channels Conrad had established. They didn't know their former leader had retired. The compartmentalization that had protected Conrad now trapped him. He was a spider caught in his own web, unable to escape the connections he'd created. The pressure intensified. His new handler, Alex, demanded intelligence Conrad could no longer provide. The Strategic Defense Initiative obsessed Moscow. They wanted technical specifications, deployment timelines, capabilities Conrad had never accessed. He made promises he couldn't keep, bought time with older intelligence repackaged as new, felt the handler's patience wearing thin. Then, in early 1987, everything changed with a single defection. Sándor Kércsik had been a colonel in Hungarian intelligence, one of the few who knew about the American sergeant who'd been hemorrhaging NATO secrets for over a decade. Disillusioned with the communist regime and facing internal investigation, Kércsik made contact with the CIA station in Vienna. Within days, he was on a plane to America. During his debriefing at a safe house in Virginia, Kércsik dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through American intelligence. There was a master sergeant, he said, possibly retired now, who'd been selling NATO's most classified documents since the mid-1970s. Kércsik didn't know the name, but he knew details. The spy was stationed in Germany. He had built a network. He had provided complete war plans. The damage was catastrophic. The investigation that followed was methodical and secret. A joint task force of FBI and Army counterintelligence agents worked with West German security services. They compiled lists of every soldier with vault access in Germany during the specified time frame. They traced financial records, looking for unexplained wealth. They analyzed known Hungarian intelligence methods, searching for patterns. Conrad's name surfaced within months. His lifestyle exceeded his pension. His bank records showed irregular deposits. His travel patterns matched suspected intelligence handoff points. But investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed someone to break. They focused on Conrad's network, though they didn't yet understand its full structure. Through careful analysis of document access logs and financial records, they identified several suspects. They began surveillance, phone taps, patient observation. They waited for someone to make a mistake. Danny Wilson cracked first. One of Conrad's later recruits, Wilson had been sloppy with his money, buying a sports car he couldn't afford on a sergeant's salary. When confronted by FBI agents in May 1988, he initially denied everything. But faced with evidence of his deposits and the promise of leniency for cooperation, Wilson began talking. He revealed Conrad's recruitment methods, the payment structure, the elaborate compartmentalization. He identified other members of the network. Each arrest led to more confessions, more names, The network collapsed like dominoes falling, each piece revealing the next. Conrad knew something was wrong before the arrests began. His handlers had gone silent weeks earlier. Phone numbers disconnected. Meeting sites remained empty. The monthly payments stopped. He was alone with his secrets and his growing fear. He could have run. With his Swiss accounts and false documents his handlers had provided, Conrad could have disappeared into Eastern Europe or South America. But he stayed, paralyzed by indecision and perhaps a strange sense of fatalism. He maintained his routine, running his computer business, having dinner with his wife, pretending normalcy while waiting for the inevitable. On August 23, 1988, Conrad woke early as always. He made coffee, read the morning paper, kissed Anya goodbye. He was walking to his Mercedes when the arrest team surrounded him. West German counterintelligence officers, polite but firm. They'd been watching him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Conrad didn't resist or protest. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a debt that had finally come due. As they drove him away, neighbors watched from windows, wondering what crime their pleasant American neighbor could have possibly committed. In his initial interrogation, Conrad said little. But investigators didn't need his confession. They had Wilson's testimony, Ramsey's cooperation, financial records, and thousands of documents that traced the path of Conrad's betrayal. They had enough to bury him. The 13-year deception was over. The accounting was about to begin. The Koblenz State Court building stood like a monument to German justice. Solid, imposing, unbending. In January 1990, Clyde Lee Conrad entered its halls to face judgment for crimes that transcended ordinary treason. The prosecutors had spent 18 months building their case. They'd assembled 12,000 pages of evidence, financial records showing mysterious deposits totaling over 1 million Deutsche Marks, testimonies from Conrad's recruited agents, each revealing another layer of betrayal. Most damning of all, they had the damage assessment, military analysts explaining in clinical detail how Conrad's espionage would have cost NATO the war. General Leopold Chalupa, former NATO intelligence chief, provided the most chilling testimony. If the Soviets had invaded using the intelligence Conrad provided, he explained, they would have known every NATO defensive position, every reinforcement route, every nuclear storage site. They could have neutralized NATO's nuclear deterrent in the first hours. They would have shattered defensive lines that appeared strong on paper, but whose weaknesses had been sold for Deutsche Marks. In the first 48 hours alone, Chalupa testified, we estimate 60,000 casualties because of compromised positions. Conrad didn't just sell documents, he sold lives. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors displayed the actual documents Conrad had photographed. Page after page of NATO's most guarded secrets, each stamped with classification levels so high that even displaying them in court required special security measures. The General Defense Plan, nuclear release protocols, communication frequencies that would coordinate the entire alliance's response to invasion. Conrad's defense attorney, Jürgen Schnabel, faced an impossible task. His client had confessed to taking documents, but denied knowing they went to the Soviets. He claimed he thought he was selling to Swedish businessmen interested in military logistics. The argument convinced no one. The sophisticated nature of the requested intelligence, the amounts paid, the elaborate security measures, everything pointed to state espionage at the highest level. Character witnesses painted a complex picture. Fellow soldiers described the professional NCO they'd known, helpful and competent. His wife, Anya, who'd divorced him after his arrest, testified she never suspected anything, thought his money came from investments. His mother, who'd flown from Ohio, wept as she described the son who'd sent money home, who'd called every Sunday, who'd seemed like a success story. But Conrad himself remained an enigma. When he finally testified, he showed no emotion, no remorse. He admitted to photographing documents, to recruiting others, to accepting money. But he insisted he'd prevented war by maintaining the balance of power. Both sides knowing everything meant neither would attack. He'd been a stabilizing force, not a traitor. The prosecution demolished this argument. East German archives, newly available after the Berlin Wall's fall, revealed how Conrad's intelligence had been used. Soviet military plans showed attack routes specifically designed to exploit weaknesses Conrad had exposed. Training exercises based on Conrad's intelligence practiced overwhelming specific NATO positions. This wasn't maintaining balance. This was handing one side a loaded gun. The most emotional testimony came from the wives of soldiers who would have defended the compromised positions. One woman, her voice breaking, asked Conrad directly, "My husband trusted the plans he studied. He believed they would keep him alive. How could you sell his life for money?" Conrad didn't answer. He stared at the table, perhaps finally understanding that his crimes weren't abstract. Every document had represented real soldiers, real families, real lives he'd valued less than Swiss bank deposits. On June 6, 1990, the verdict came. Guilty of high treason. Guilty of espionage. Guilty of compromising the Federal Republic of Germany's security. The judge's words rang through the courtroom with moral weight, beyond legal terminology. Conrad had violated not just laws, but sacred truths. The trust between soldiers, the faith of nations in their defenders, the belief that some things transcend price. The sentence, life imprisonment. The maximum allowed under German law. Conrad showed no reaction. His handlers had abandoned him. His network had collapsed. His wealth sat frozen in accounts he'd never access. The man who'd once held NATO's secrets now faced decades in a cell, his world shrinking to concrete walls and iron bars. His accomplices received lesser sentences. Ramsey got 4 years. Rondeau, 3. Others received suspended sentences in exchange for cooperation. They emerged from prison to find themselves pariahs, their military service forever tainted, their names synonymous with betrayal. The trial's aftermath rippled through NATO. Security procedures changed overnight. Document handling protocols were revolutionized. Background checks intensified. The alliance had learned that its greatest vulnerability wasn't Soviet tanks or missiles, but the hollow men within its own ranks who saw duty as commodity. In Moscow, Conrad's former handlers watched the trial with professional interest, but no sympathy. He'd been an asset, nothing more. His arrest was unfortunate, but not unexpected. Intelligence services don't mourn lost spies. They simply recruit new ones. As guards led Conrad from the courtroom to begin his life sentence, photographers captured a face devoid of emotion. The master sergeant who'd betrayed the Western Alliance for 13 years had finally run out of secrets to sell. Cell Prison, where Conrad served his sentence, was a modern facility 90 miles north of his former life in Bad Kreuznach. His cell measured 8 by 12 feet, smaller than the vault he'd once commanded. The walls were painted institutional green. A narrow window showed a rectangle of German sky. This would be his world, until death. Prison officials described Conrad as a model inmate. He followed routines, caused no trouble, spoke little. He worked in the prison library, organizing books with the same meticulous attention he'd once applied to classified documents. Other inmates knew his crime, but left him alone. Even among criminals, traitors occupy a special category of contempt. Conrad received few visitors. His mother came once, a painful meeting that ended with her sobbing while he sat stone-faced across the reinforced glass. She never returned. Former colleagues avoided him entirely. The Brotherhood of Soldiers has no room for those who sell their comrades' lives. Letters arrived occasionally from journalists, historians, intelligence scholars seeking insight into his motivations. Conrad never responded. What could he say? That he'd done it purely for money? That he'd felt no ideology, no higher purpose, just the thrill of growing bank accounts? The truth was more damning than any lie. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The empire Conrad had served without believing in ceased to exist. The war plans he'd sold became historical curiosities. The invasion scenarios he'd compromised would never be tested. History had rendered his betrayal meaningless in the grand scope of events, though not in its moral weight. His former handlers fared differently. Zoltan Sabo disappeared into the chaos of post-communist Hungary, his intelligence career erased, his existence denied. The KGB officers who'd run Conrad's intelligence were now unemployed, their skills obsolete in the New World Order. Some became businessmen, others drank themselves to death. None spared thoughts for their imprisoned American asset. The money Conrad had earned, over 1.2 million Deutsche Marks by FBI estimates, remained frozen in various accounts. Swiss banks, following legal orders, refused to release funds earned through espionage. The house he'd bought his mother was sold to pay legal fees. The comfortable German life he'd built crumbled entirely. All that wealth, all those risks, had purchased nothing lasting. Meanwhile, the damage assessment continued. Military historians studying Warsaw Pact archives after communism's fall discovered the true extent of Conrad's betrayal. Soviet war plans from the 1980s showed detailed knowledge of NATO positions that could only have come from Conrad's network. Training exercises had practiced exploiting specific weaknesses he'd revealed. One Russian general, interviewed years later, admitted that Conrad's intelligence had been worth more than dozens of spy satellites. "He gave us NATO's soul," the general said. "We knew not just what they would do, but why and how. In war, such knowledge is priceless." On January 8, 1998, morning rounds at Celle prison found Conrad dead in his cell. Heart attack, the medical examiner determined. He was 60 years old, having served less than 8 years of his life sentence. Prison officials found nothing unusual. No suicide note, no final confession. Just an old man whose heart had stopped, alone in a concrete room. His death merited brief mentions in American newspapers. Most readers didn't recognize his name. The Cold War had been over for 7 years. New threats occupied public attention. Conrad's betrayal seemed like ancient history, a relic from a world of two superpowers that no longer existed. But in military academies and intelligence schools, Conrad's case became required study. Not for its tradecraft. His methods were competent, but not brilliant. Rather, instructors used his story to illustrate a fundamental truth about human nature and national security. The greatest threats come not from committed ideological enemies, but from the morally empty among us, those who see everything as commodity, nothing as sacred. What makes someone betray their country for money? Not poverty. Conrad earned a decent military salary, not ideology. He believed in nothing, not coercion. He volunteered his treason. The answer lies perhaps in a fundamental disconnection from human community, an inability to value anything beyond personal gain. The soldiers who served alongside Conrad, who handled the same documents, who faced the same temptations, had something he lacked, a connection to purposes greater than themselves. They understood that their oath meant something, that trust between soldiers transcends personal profit, that some things cannot be bought or sold. Conrad died as he had lived his last 13 years, alone, trusted by no one, mourning nothing but lost opportunity for greater profit. His legacy isn't the secrets he sold or the damage he caused, but the reminder he provides that in every generation, in every institution, there exist hollow individuals who would sell anything for the right price. The fog that shrouded Bad Kreuznach on the morning of Conrad's arrest was nothing compared to the moral fog in which he lived and died. He gained wealth he could never spend, bought freedom that became imprisonment, earned contempt from all sides. In the end, Clyde Lee Conrad discovered the price of everything and the value of nothing. His life stands as testament to a simple truth. Betrayal is the loneliest profession, and treason's wages are always paid in full.